The sound of the slap rang out across the gilded ballroom of the cliffside estate, sharp and merciless, echoing off the marble pillars and the crystal chandeliers that hung overhead like frozen constellations. In that instant, more than 60 of the city's most influential guests, men and women who had signed billion-dollar deals without so much as blinking, sat frozen in utter silence. Not one of them dared to breathe. The man who delivered the blow was Marcus Sterling, 46 years old, a senator's husband and the owner of a chain of luxury resorts across 3 continents. His salt and pepper hair was swept back with precision, his wrists heavy with platinum watches, his entire presence radiating the unshakable belief that his alpha status and accumulated wealth were proof of his natural superiority. The one who received it was Elias Vance, 29, a housekeeper in a simple gray uniform, his dark auburn hair pulled neatly back, his hands bearing the quiet roughness of years of labor, and a pair of storm gray eyes that were strangely, almost unsettlingly, calm. He didn't raise a hand to his cheek. He didn't step back. He simply turned his face slowly back to center and looked Marcus Sterling straight in the eye with a composure that sent a chill through the entire room. A feeling none of them could quite name. "People like you should know your place," Marcus pronounced, like a judge delivering a verdict. "A thief is always a thief. It's in your blood. Omegas are all the same. Desperate, grasping, incapable of honesty." But what he didn't know, what not a single soul in that glittering room knew, was that the Omega he'd just struck and branded a thief was no ordinary housekeeper. For 7 long years, Elias Vance had been the only person allowed into the most private chambers of this estate's owner. The only one who held the keys to rooms even his head of security wasn't permitted to enter. The only one who had ever held in his hands secrets powerful enough to destroy empires, and who had chosen silence. And the man who owned that empire, Julian Cross, 36 years old, an alpha so formidable that his very presence seemed to bend the air around him, cold and quiet, with a faint scar along his jawline from an incident no one dared ask about, and a gaze that seemed to weigh every soul that passed before him. His dark hair was always perfectly in place, his suits tailored to emphasize the powerful frame beneath, and his scent, cedar and smoke and something darker, was notorious for making even other alphas step back in instinctive deference. He was at that very moment opening the door of his study at the far end of the hall. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to, because in just a few minutes, Marcus Sterling was about to learn a truth he'd never once considered in his entire privileged life, that the person who truly didn't understand where they stood tonight wasn't the Omega in the gray uniform, but himself. 16 hours before that slap rang out, when the sun had not yet managed to climb over the horizon beyond the sea, and the whole estate still lay submerged in the silver-gray light of early dawn, Elias Vance had already awakened. As he had always awakened for the past 7 years, before anyone else in this house opened their eyes. He moved through the long, seemingly endless corridors covered with carpets so thick that the sound of his footsteps almost dissolved into the air. Perhaps that was exactly what made people so easily forget his presence, because Elias moved through that house in the manner of someone who had memorized every corner, every seam of light, every tiny crack in the paint that an ordinary eye would never notice. Quiet and certain as water slipping through stone. He didn't hurry, but he was never late. Every movement he made carried a strange economy, not one wasted gesture, not one wasted breath. As if he had long understood that a human being's energy was a precious thing that should not be scattered over what was meaningless. When he wiped the thin layer of dust from the grand piano in the main sitting room, he did it with complete attention, as if nothing else in the world existed at that moment except the grain of wood beneath his fingers. And when he adjusted a flower that leaned slightly inside the crystal vase, he stepped back half a pace, tilted his head to observe it, then touched it again. Not because anyone would notice, but because he himself would know if it was not perfect. That was what outsiders rarely understood about Elias. He didn't work in order to be seen. He worked for the work itself, for that quiet and enduring feeling of knowing that something had been done properly, decently, with all he had, even if not a single pair of eyes was there to witness it. The other servants in the estate sometimes talked animatedly between shifts, telling one another rumors about the master of the house, about the mysterious guests who came and went at midnight, about the luxury cars parked outside the gate with darkened windows no one could see through. But Elias rarely added a word. He listened, nodded, smiled just enough not to be considered cold, then returned to his duties. Carrying within himself the habit of keeping things hidden that life had taught him very early, that there were silences worth more than any words, and that a person who knew when to keep their mouth shut was often far safer than one who didn't. There was a stillness radiating from him, a kind of stillness that even those who disliked him had to admit was difficult to touch, like the smooth surface of a lake at daybreak, not because nothing moved beneath its depths, but because he had learned not to let the surface reflect the currents below. When a young maid newly hired at the estate dropped a silver tray onto the marble floor and stood frozen in fear, her face drained white as she waited for reproof, it was Elias who stepped forward, quietly bent down to help pick up the scattered spoons, and said softly, just loud enough for the girl to hear, that everyone had days when their hands trembled. The important thing was to remember to hold on more firmly next time. Then he rose, lightly brushed his apron, and continued on as if nothing had happened, leaving behind a bewildered girl who watched him go, unable to understand why the quietest person in the house was the only one who did not make her feel afraid. Because Elias knew too well the feeling of judgment sweeping over him before he could even open his mouth, knew too well the chill down his spine when standing in a room and sensing that people had already decided who he was before he had the chance to prove otherwise. And because he had carried that feeling for too long and too deeply, he had sworn to himself that he would never be the one to plant it in someone else. That morning, in the pale, gentle light filtering through the tall windows that reached the ceiling, Elias moved through the house like a soft shadow, completely unaware that before the moon rose high tonight, the very stillness forged through so many years would be tested in front of 60 people, and that the dignity he had quietly guarded would become the only thing strong enough to keep him standing. When the morning light had grown clear enough to reveal the lines of the house, Elias entered the small room hidden behind the main study, a room that aside from him, no one else among the estate's large household staff had a key to open. Inside was a security safe built into the wall, something Julian Cross had brought in from a maker in Switzerland, with a thick steel shell and a biometric lock whose code existed in the memory of only 2 people in the world. Elias was one of those 2. Whenever the estate received important guests, according to a procedure the master himself had established many years before, every valuable piece of jewelry the guests left in safekeeping, every bracelet, every pair of earrings, every gemstone worth as much as an ordinary person's entire fortune, had to be carefully inventoried, written into a leather-covered ledger, numbered, then placed inside that safe in its own separate compartment. And the only person entrusted with this responsibility, the only person he trusted to lay hands on those possessions, was not the seasoned head of security, not the chief butler who had served the family for decades, but Elias, the quiet Omega in his simple uniform. He carried out that work with a seriousness that was almost ceremonial, his calloused fingers gently lifting each item beneath the light, checking it against the written note, then placing it in its proper compartment. And each time he closed the steel door, he turned the lock twice and tested it once more. Not because he doubted himself, but because he understood that trust, once placed in a human being, was the heaviest thing a person could carry. And once he had accepted it, he would not allow himself to be careless for even a moment. The longtime workers in the estate all knew this clearly, and it had created an invisible distance between Elias and the rest of the staff. Not the distance of jealousy or rejection, but a kind of respect that was difficult to name. The kind of respect people give to someone they do not truly understand, yet instinctively feel can be trusted. The chief butler, An older beta who had seen countless people come and go in that house had once told a colleague that in all his years of service, he had never seen the master hand over the key to anything to anyone except that Omega. And that if Julian Cross had chosen to trust a person to such a degree, then that person must carry within him a quality money could not buy and words could not fake. The younger staff looked at Elias differently, with both curiosity and admiration, often whispering to one another whenever they saw him step out of the room behind the study with the leather-covered ledger tucked beneath his arm, wondering what in the end he had done, what he had proven to earn a position even the most senior servants had never been allowed to touch. But none of them dared ask him directly, and Elias never offered the story himself, because to him, the master's trust was not something to boast about or turn into a tale for conversation, but a responsibility he carried in silence. An invisible cord tying him to this house, with a bond stronger than any contract or wage. The seriousness Elias brought into every gesture, the way he guarded trust as if guarding a fragile treasure. This was not something a person learned in school or shaped in a single day. It was the only inheritance his mother had left him, a kind of wealth that was not kept inside any steel safe, and that no one could steal. His father had passed away when he was still too young to hold on to any complete memory of him, leaving only a faint shape in his mind, a voice he was no longer sure was real or had been drawn up by the imagination of a child growing up without a father. From then on, mother and son carried each other through cramped rented rooms, through winters when warmth had to be divided carefully, little by little, through meals where his mother always said she was already full so that Elias could have the larger share. His mother was an Omega who washed clothes and cleaned houses for the better-off families in the area. Her hands soaked in water and soap all year until the skin cracked. But Elias had never once seen her bow her head before the people who paid her. Never once seen her let poverty bend her back into a timid posture. She entered other people's homes to work with a straight spine and steady eyes, did her work decently and completely, accepted her small wages with a polite thank you, and then left with that same upright bearing. It was that image repeated over and over through Elias's childhood that imprinted itself on his heart more deeply than any lesson. His mother often told him on evenings when the two of them sat beside the small lamp in their rented room that people could take many things from you. They could take money, take a roof, take even the chances you deserve to have. But there was one thing no one in this world had the right to touch unless you handed it over yourself, and that was your dignity. The way you looked at yourself in the mirror each morning and knew you had lived honestly. Elias was too young then to fully understand those words, but he remembered them, tucked them away in a hidden place inside his heart, only to understand many years later just how precious they were. When his mother fell ill, the sickness quietly gnawing at her from within, beginning with bouts of fatigue she tried to hide, then long nights of coughing that would not stop, and finally the days when she no longer had the strength to get out of bed, Elias did everything his son could do. He took on more work, labored from dawn until late at night, saved every coin with the fragile hope that if he had enough money, there would be some way, some medicine, some doctor who could keep his mother with him a little longer. But the money he earned was always less than the price life demanded, and he had to stand there watching the only person in the world who loved him quietly weaken day by day in a helplessness no words could fully describe. His mother passed away on a peaceful autumn morning, just as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window. And the last thing she did before closing her eyes was take her son's hand, squeeze it very gently, and say with the thin breath she had left that Elias must never let anyone make him believe he was beneath them, because he wasn't. Those words followed Elias through the rest of his life, not like a bleeding wound, but like a small flame carefully kept inside his chest, warm and enduring, lighting his way through his loneliest years. He didn't cry much at his mother's funeral. Not because he didn't hurt, but because he understood that the deepest grief was often the quietest, and that the best way to remember a person who had lived uprightly until her final breath was not to collapse, but to keep standing straight exactly as that person had taught him. After his mother died, Elias stepped into life with empty hands and a heart still warmed by the flame his mother had left behind. That year, he had just turned 20, old enough to care for himself, yet still far too unseasoned before the schemes of a world whose cruelty he had not yet fully understood. He found work as a housekeeper in the mansion of one of the wealthiest families in the city, a place where the carpet laid across the entrance alone was worth more than many years of rent for him and his mother combined. A frequent guest of that house, a relative of the owner, was a wealthy alpha named Marcus Sterling, whose cold pride Elias would never forget. It was this alpha who later accused Elias of stealing a diamond ring. A man handsome in a cold way, always dressed in expensive clothes, looking at the servants the way one might look at pieces of furniture that happened to move, useful when needed, and invisible when they were not. Elias worked there with all the devotion his mother had taught him, arriving early, leaving late, never speaking one word of complaint, quietly completing every task he was given with the severe standard he set for himself. And for a while, he was naive enough to believe that if he worked well enough and honestly enough, people would treat him fairly. He was wrong. One afternoon, the mistress discovered that a diamond ring had vanished from the jewelry box in her private room. And instead of seeking the truth, she needed only to sweep her eyes once across the servants and stop at Elias, the poorest person there, the newest one, the Omega with no one behind him and no voice in that house. Then she made the accusation in the firm voice of someone who believed her position gave her the right never to be mistaken. And Marcus Sterling, who happened to be present, had added his own vicious agreement. An Omega, he had said, his voice dripping with contempt. Of course, they can't help themselves. It's in their biology, weak-willed, dishonest, always looking for an easy way. Elias had stood in that splendid room among the probing eyes of the other servants who quickly lowered their heads to keep from being involved. And he said, in a voice that trembled but did not waver, that he had not taken the ring, that he was willing to let them search anything that belonged to him. But those honest words fell into emptiness like raindrops falling on a stone, leaving no trace behind. The mistress didn't even bother to listen until the end. She merely waved her hand to signal the housekeeper, declared that people like Elias didn't deserve to be trusted, that he had to leave the house that very night, and that of course he would receive not 1 cent for the month he had worked. Because in that woman's words, a thief didn't deserve to be paid. That money was everything Elias had been relying on to pay the remaining debt from his mother's final days. The only thin life raft keeping him from sinking all the way to the bottom. And having it torn from his hands so unjustly pushed him into the most miserable month he had ever known. Nights with no place to shelter, long stretches of hunger, moments when he thought the flame his mother had given him might finally be blown out because the winds of life were too cold. But what carved itself most deeply into his heart was not the hunger or the cold. It was the feeling of being judged and condemned without even one chance to clear his own name. The feeling of standing before someone who held power and money in their hands, watching that person decide who he was, paste a label onto him that did not belong to him, then brush their hands clean and walk away as if they had only thrown out a piece of trash. In those dark nights, Elias didn't allow himself to collapse, though the rage often rose so high it choked his throat. Though that injustice was like a blade driven into the deepest place of his self-respect. He quietly swallowed it, didn't turn it into hatred, but forged it into a kind of steel. And he promised himself that no matter how many wrongful accusations life might throw in his face, he would never let them make him believe he was beneath anyone. He would never let any person, no matter how rich or powerful, strip from him the one thing his mother had told him to guard at all costs. And he could never have imagined that many years later, the very cold face that had once condemned him would return, seated in the middle of a gilded hall, to perform the exact same cruel drama all over again. It took Elias many struggling years, doing every kind of honest work just to survive, before he slowly found his footing again. And then, On a late winter afternoon, 7 years earlier, fate placed in his hands a test he had no idea would change his entire life. At the time, he was on his way home from an extra shift, his coat pocket nearly empty, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of his jacket, when he saw it lying abandoned on the stone bench of a small roadside park. A luxurious black leather briefcase, the kind of thing only people who belong to another world would own. Forgotten or dropped in the bitter chill of dusk when there was not another soul around. Elias stopped, looked around, then picked it up. And when he opened it to see if there was anything inside that might tell him who its owner was, he found thick stacks of documents, contracts, figures, and names that even at a glance were enough for him to understand that these were matters of great importance. Sensitive information about business and money that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could cause damage beyond measure to the person who owned them. In that moment, a thought passed through his mind. Not the thought of taking it for himself, but only the fleeting recognition that these papers to some people might be worth more than an entire fortune. And that he, a poor Omega so desperate he had to count every coin for tomorrow's meal, was holding something many people would pay any price to possess. But that thought only flickered and vanished as quickly as it had come. Because immediately within his heart, he heard his mother's voice. The words his mother had spoken on those nights beside the small lamp, that there were things no one had the right to take from you unless you gave them away yourself. And there were also things you must never take if they did not belong to you, no matter how high the price of honesty might be. Elias found among the documents a business card with a name and a phone number. And instead of doing what desperation might have tempted him to do, he called that number, clearly stated who he was, what he had found, and where he had found it, then stood waiting in the cutting cold until a black luxury car glided toward him. And from inside stepped a man he had never met, a man who carried with him a presence that seemed to make the very air around him harden. That was the first time Elias saw Julian Cross, and the first look the Alpha gave him held not a trace of gratitude or friendliness, but a cold, sharp, searching suspicion. The look of a man so accustomed to betrayal that he no longer knew how to believe in kindness offered for no reason. He took the briefcase from Elias's hand, opened it right there, and slowly, meticulously turned through each page to check whether anything was missing, whether there was any sign that it had been copied or disturbed. And through all that time he didn't speak a single word, only occasionally lifted his eyes to look at Elias, as though he wanted to read all the way down to the bottom of his soul and see what he was planning. Elias stood still beneath that gaze, neither shaken nor eager to explain, not trying to make himself seem pitiful in hopes of a reward. He simply waited in silence, standing straight in the manner his mother had passed down to him. And when Julian finally closed the briefcase, certain that everything was still intact, he looked at Elias once more, this time for longer, as if he were seeing something he had not expected and could not easily explain. He asked him why he had not kept it, why someone as clearly in need as he was had not taken advantage of this chance. And Elias answered with only one simple sentence: because it wasn't mine. The way he said those words, without a hint of hesitation, without a hint of display, made that cold and suspicious Alpha fall silent for the first time in many years, as he looked at a stranger with something very close to respect. A few days after that meeting in the winter cold, a phone call reached Elias, and the person on the other end informed him that Julian Cross wanted to invite him to work in his estate, an offer that at first made him hesitate, because he knew too well the feeling of stepping into a wealthy house only to be treated like an object. But in the end, he accepted, partly because of his circumstances, and partly because of some faint instinct telling him that this man was different from the masters he had known years before. And he was not wrong. In the early days, Julian still kept the same coldness and suspicion that had settled into his very blood and bone. He observed Elias from a distance. He gave him small tasks, then silently checked whether he did exactly what he had promised, whether he truly was the person that winter afternoon had briefly shown him. Because in the world Julian lived in, trust was the rarest and most expensive luxury, something that, if given wrongly, could cost a person things far more precious than money. But month after month, year after year, Elias proved who he was. Not through vows or attempts to win favor, but through the quiet consistency of the smallest acts. Through the way he always told the truth even when the truth was inconvenient for him. Through the way he never pried into matters that did not belong to him even when they unfolded right before his eyes. Through the way he kept every accidental thing he heard or saw inside that house as though it had been sealed inside a safe whose key he had swallowed. Julian was a demanding master to the point of severity. He never praised easily, never showed satisfaction openly, and everyone who worked under him understood that one small mistake was enough to be replaced without mercy. Yet the strange thing was that no matter how cold he was, he never once spoke to Elias in the condescending tone wealthy people so often used with servants. Never once looked at him as if he were beneath him. He knocked before entering a room where Elias was working, called him by name properly instead of merely waving him forward with his hand. And once, when a powerful guest made an indecent remark to Elias, a crude comment about Omega's servants being available, it was Julian himself who coldly reminded that guest that in this house, the people who worked for him were treated with respect. No exceptions. Over time, he entrusted Elias with more and more responsibilities he gave to no one else, from managing the most private areas of the estate to safeguarding its most valuable possessions. And each time Elias received that trust with the same composed manner, neither proud nor afraid, simply doing his part with all the care he possessed. Between two people who by all appearances belonged to two separate worlds, there slowly formed a feeling difficult to name. Not family affection, nor anything that crossed the boundary of work, but a deep and durable respect built over the years from an unspoken understanding that both of them, where people life, had once taught painful lessons about betrayal. And both had chosen to answer with honesty instead of deceit. Julian knew that among all the people surrounding him, from his business associates to his loyal guards, there was not one person he could trust completely the way he trusted the quiet Omega in the gray uniform. The one who had once had the chance to destroy him with a single phone call and had instead chosen to return to him what belonged to him. And that was why, when tonight's important gala was being planned with more than 60 of the city's most powerful guests gathering under one roof, Julian didn't entrust the coordination of private service to anyone but Elias, placing in his hands the responsibility of making sure everything behind the scenes ran smoothly. Never imagining that the very evening he had entrusted to him was about to become the night his honesty would be tested in the cruelest way. When night fell, and the cliffside estate blazed beneath hundreds of crystal lights, luxury cars glided one after another up to the front steps. And from them emerged people whose names the whole city knew. Real estate tycoons, bankers, politicians with carefully rehearsed smiles, all wrapped in the splendor of a world where money was the common language. Among that stream of guests, a glossy black car came to a stop, and the man who stepped out was Marcus Sterling, 46 years old, his graying hair styled elaborately down to every strand, wearing an expensive evening suit and a watch at his wrist so glittering that every step he took seemed to drag a halo of light behind him. He crossed the threshold with the bearing of an alpha who believed with complete certainty that every space he entered had to turn around his presence. His chin lifted slightly, his eyes moving over the crowd not to greet people but to appraise them, to sort out who in the room was worth the effort of his smile and who was merely the blurred background for his arrival. A young beta server stepped forward with a polite smile, reaching out to take the luxurious wool coat from Marcus's shoulders. And Marcus let the coat fall, without even bothering to glance at the young man. Without a word of thanks. Without a nod. The coat simply leaving his shoulders and dropping into the space where he assumed some pair of hands must be waiting to catch it. To Marcus, the people in service uniforms in that room were not individuals with names and ages, with sorrows and joys, with private lives of their own, but a category. A kind of tool that existed to perform its function and vanish when it was no longer needed. He moved deeper into the great hall, stopping to shake hands with a few guests he considered equal to his level, handing out polished pleasantries honed through years of moving through rooms like this one. And in every gesture there radiated an absolute and unshaken belief that a person's worth was measured by the number in their account. That wealth was not merely a fortunate circumstance but proof, a verdict, a confirmation of something better and nobler already placed within his alpha nature. Something those lowly omegas could never possess. Marcus Sterling was not cruel in a way that required effort. He didn't need to try to be cold. His contempt for those he considered beneath him flowed out naturally and lazily like water running downhill, because it had sunk so deeply into him that he didn't even realize he was being contemptuous. Just as people don't realize they are breathing. In all his life, he had never once suffered consequences for the way he treated people he deemed below him. Never once had anyone powerful enough or brave enough to force him to look at himself. And it was precisely that immunity from consequence built over so many years that made him believe the world operated according to the order he had always trusted. An order in which alphas like him sat high above, while omegas like the one who had just caught his coat remained forever below. He came to Julian Cross's estate filled with confidence, carrying inside him the expectation that this evening would be a chance to strengthen important business connections, to affirm once again his position among the city's elite. And as he stepped into that magnificent gilded space, sweeping his eyes over everything with the gaze of someone always ready to find a flaw to judge, he could not possibly imagine that in only a few short hours, the iron certainty about rank and power he had held all his life would be shattered in this very room before all the people whose respect he so desperately desired. The first hours of the gala passed in a polished and graceful atmosphere. The soft sound of piano music slipping through the low murmur of conversation, crystal glasses glittering beneath the lights, and the service staff moving among the clusters of guests with the invisible rhythm of people trained to be present without drawing attention. Among them was Theo, a 19-year-old beta who had not been working there long, his face still boyish, and his eyes still carrying the tense brightness of someone young who was trying with all his strength to do well at his first real job. He carried a silver tray filled with glasses of red wine, moving carefully through the crowd with intense concentration. And when he passed the place where Marcus Sterling stood among a group of powerful guests, something happened that later those with sharp eyes standing nearby would silently understand had not been an accident at all. Marcus, at the exact moment Theo went by, casually pushed out his elbow. A small, quick movement so slight that almost no one noticed in time, nudging the edge of the tray just enough to make one glass sway and then tip over, sending several dark drops of wine splashing onto the lapel of his expensive evening jacket. In an instant, Theo's face went white with panic. He hurried to steady the tray before anything else could fall, and began stammering an apology. But before he could finish, Marcus turned sharply toward him, and his voice rose, not very loud, but so icy and full of authority that the conversations around him immediately died away. He scolded the young man for being clumsy, called him the kind of person who was not capable of handling even the simplest task, said that a venue calling itself high-end should be ashamed to hire people like him, that he had ruined a jacket likely worth more than he earned in an entire year. And he poured out those words with the calm cruelty of someone far too accustomed to venting anger on the powerless without ever having to face a consequence. Theo stood rooted in place, his face flushing red and then turning pale again, his hands trembling around the tray. And the humiliation written so clearly across his young face made several nearby guests look away in discomfort. But not one of them spoke up, because stepping into the fury of someone like Marcus Sterling brought no benefit to anyone. It was at that moment, from the far end of the great hall, that Elias immediately sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. The way the sounds had suddenly dropped, the tense silence spreading outward like ripples across water. And with the instinct sharpened by years of working in spaces like this, he understood that something had gone off course. He set down what he was holding, then walked toward the crowd with his usual calm stride, neither hurried nor hesitant. And when he reached them, he gently placed himself between Marcus and the trembling young man like a soft wall shielding him from the storm. He spoke to Marcus in a measured and respectful voice, offering an apology for the inconvenience the gentleman had suffered, assuring him that the jacket would be attended to immediately, and that the rest of the evening would proceed perfectly. He said all of it without lowering his head in submission, without a trace of fear in his eyes. His calm so complete that it could almost have been mistaken for indifference, though in truth it was the composure of a person who knew exactly what he was doing, soothing the situation rather than kneeling before it. Marcus looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time, his eyes slowly sweeping from Elias's composed face down to his simple gray uniform, pausing at his straight posture and the strange stillness radiating from this Omega. And something in that stillness made Marcus feel vaguely irritated, like the annoyance of pushing against a door that refused to open the way he wanted it to. He said nothing more, but as Elias led the young man away, Marcus's eyes continued to follow him, and in that gaze lingered a cold contempt, the kind of contempt not aimed at one particular person, but at an entire class. The gaze of someone who had long ago finished judging what sort of person stood before him, and how much that person was worth. About 1 hour after the incident with the young server, when the gala had moved into the buffet portion and the guests had begun scattering throughout the great hall with glasses of wine in their hands, Marcus Sterling went to the private reception area, where according to the procedure Julian Cross had established long ago, guests could leave jewelry that was too valuable or too cumbersome to be safely worn throughout the evening. He lifted a hand to his throat and removed the diamond tie pin he had been wearing, a piece that anyone could tell with one glance was no ordinary adornment, with stones cut so exquisitely that they caught the light and glittered with every movement. And he said in his usual condescending tone that this was an heirloom of his family worth more than the home of anyone standing there in service, and that he expected it to be watched with care. The person assigned to receive and handle those items according to the security procedure was none other than Elias. And he stepped forward, still carrying the calm manner that had become part of his very nature, accepting the tie pin from Marcus's hand with measured gentleness, not gasping in admiration at its value as Marcus perhaps secretly expected, but simply treating it exactly as he treated every possession entrusted to him, with the care of someone who understood the weight of the responsibility he was carrying. Under Marcus's eyes and those of several nearby guests, Elias opened the familiar leather-covered ledger, clearly and meticulously recorded the description of the piece, the time it was received, and then assigned a number to that entry, exactly according to the order he had never once broken. The contrast between the two men in that moment was so clear that anyone perceptive could feel it. One of them, Marcus with his showy impatience, repeatedly reminding everyone of the item's value, as if wanting to make sure the Omega in front of him fully understood what an important thing he had been handed. And the other, Elias, quiet and precise, not allowing the material worth of the tie pin to alter even by a fraction the way he carried out his work. Because to him, an object worth a fortune and an ordinary silver tray both deserved the same degree of seriousness. After finishing the record, Elias carried the tie pin into the small room hidden behind the study, the room to which only he had the key. And there, beneath the quiet light, he opened the wall safe with the code that existed in the memory of only two people, placed the jewelry into its own separate compartment according to the number written in the ledger, then closed the steel door, turned the lock twice, and tested it once more as he always did. A motion that had become a ritual so deeply rooted in habit that he performed it almost without needing to think. Everything had gone exactly according to procedure without one misstep. The tie pin now lay safely inside the heart of the safe, fully recorded in the ledger, locked behind 2 turns of the lock, and a door no one else in the estate besides him could open. Elias locked the room door, slipped the key back onto the small chain he always wore close to his body beneath his clothing, then returned to the Great Hall to continue overseeing his duties. His heart entirely at peace as it always was, because he knew he had fulfilled his responsibility beyond reproach. That the item entrusted to him was in the safest place it could possibly be, and that if anyone asked about it, he needed only to open the ledger, open the safe, and everything would appear clearly and transparently as daylight. He could not possibly know that this very transparency, this perfect procedure he had just carried out with practiced ease, was about to be deliberately ignored by someone, trampled beneath an accusation hurled not in pursuit of truth, but because of a malice that had already been waiting, and that the tie pin resting safely inside the steel safe would soon become the excuse for a public humiliation in the middle of a crowded room. About half an hour later, when the party was at its liveliest, Marcus Sterling suddenly raised his voice in the middle of the Great Hall, and that voice carried a tone entirely different from his usual condescension, the tone of outrage carefully staged. He declared that his family heirloom diamond tie pin had vanished, that he had just asked for it, and no one could return it to him, and that in a house crawling with servants, it was hardly difficult to understand how an item of such value could disappear into thin air. Those words immediately caused the surrounding conversations to fall silent. The guests began turning their heads to look, and Marcus, as if strengthened by the very attention he was drawing, swept his eyes around the crowd and then stopped on Elias, who had just stepped forward after hearing the commotion. He pointed straight at him and loudly accused this Omega of being the last person to hold the tie pin in his hands, of having carried it somewhere, and of being, Marcus was certain, the one who had stolen it. Elias stood still for a moment, not flustered by the sudden accusation. And then he spoke, his voice still calm and clear, explaining that the tie pin had been received according to procedure, carefully recorded in the ledger, and safely placed in the safe. And that if Marcus wished, Elias could open the safe immediately to prove that the item was still intact inside. He offered this with the steady confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. And if Marcus had simply nodded, if he had agreed to follow Elias to the small room behind the study, the entire performance could have ended within a few short minutes with the truth laid bare. But that was exactly what Marcus didn't want. He had no intention of allowing the truth to be proven, because his anger had never truly been about the tie pin, but about something deeper. A smoldering irritation that had begun from the moment the Omega in the gray uniform dared place himself between Marcus and the young server, dared face him with that unyielding stillness. So the moment Elias finished speaking and turned as if to lead him toward the safe, Marcus immediately cut him off with a dismissive wave of the hand, declaring that he had no need to go anywhere to inspect anything, that he didn't believe a single word from the mouth of someone like Elias, and that this little act of opening the safe to prove his innocence was nothing more than a clumsy performance by a dishonest person trying to conceal his guilt. He raised his voice even higher, and this time his words no longer circled around the tie pin, but shifted into something far crueler, more personal. He began to stab at Elias himself, at Elias's biology, saying that he knew very well what dark places people like him came from, that Omegas were all the same, weak-willed, dishonest, incapable of controlling their base instincts, that those rough, calloused hands were the mark of a lowly life, that the blood of the destitute, no matter how many layers of decency they wrapped around themselves, could never wash clean the thieving nature inside, that it was in their very biology to be grasping and untrustworthy. Every word he spoke was like a knife aimed directly at the place he believed to be this Omega's weakest point, and he said them with the triumphant voice of someone certain he was standing on a high platform from which he could freely cast any judgment he pleased down upon those below. The entire great hall had now sunk into a thick silence, every eye fixed on the two men. And while Marcus climbed higher and higher into his fury, growing louder and more vicious as though fed by the very crowd watching him, Elias remained standing there, his back straight, his head lifted, his storm-gray eyes fixed directly on the Alpha, insulting him without blinking, without turning away. without retreating even half a step. He didn't answer those insults. He didn't try to argue or explain further, because he had realized something that perhaps the whole room was beginning to realize as well, that this alpha was not searching for the truth, not searching for his Tai-Pin, but searching only for a victim upon whom he could pour the power and contempt he had grown used to dispensing. And Elias's steady silence, instead of soothing Marcus's rage, seemed to feed that fire in a way that in only a moment more would flare into something that could not be taken back. Elias's stillness, that calm refusal to break apart, seemed to become something Marcus could no longer endure. Because for an alpha accustomed to seeing others tremble and shrink before his anger, facing someone who still stood straight and looked directly into his eyes without fear was an insult even greater than any argument. He stepped closer, his diamond-covered finger pointing straight at Elias's chest, and his voice rang out shrill and sharp in the breathless great hall, demanding that the Omega lower his head and confess at once, that he admit before everyone that he was a thief, that he was not worthy to stand in a room like this. Elias still said nothing. He only looked at the alpha pouring fury over him with an almost unsettling calm, a gaze that held neither challenge nor pleading, only the steady presence of a person who knew exactly who he was and refused to let another person's words define him differently. And it was that firm silence, that unshaken posture, that pushed Marcus past the final line of restraint. His hand flew up. It was not a wide movement. It was short, sharp, and fast enough that the whole room only understood what had happened after it had already happened. And the sound rang out, a dry, clear crack echoing between the marble walls and crystal chandeliers, filling the space that had already grown thick with silence. Elias's head tilted slightly to one side for a brief moment, then slowly returned to where it had been. He didn't lift a hand to his cheek. He didn't make a sound. He didn't step back even half a pace. He simply stood there, his gray eyes still fixed on Marcus with the same unwavering composure he had carried from the beginning. And in that stillness, there was something the entire room could feel but could not name, an invisible weight that seemed to freeze the air itself. Marcus stood there, his hands still hanging loosely at his side after the blow, his breathing a little quicker. And a strange flicker crossed his face, not quite regret, but the first vague awareness that the silence in the room now had a very different quality from the silence only seconds before. Elias allowed the moment to settle. Then he spoke, and his voice was so soft that the guests at the nearest tables had to lean forward to hear it. A quiet voice, so utterly controlled and without emotion that it created a chilling emptiness in the center of the room. He asked whether Marcus was certain he truly understood what he had just done. That question, spoken calmly and without any open threat, carried a force that made Marcus pause. And to hide the unease just beginning to stir inside him, he let out a short, contemptuous laugh, a sound aimed as much at the crowd as at Elias. Then he turned to a nearby server and ordered, in the voice of someone certain his command must be obeyed immediately, that he wanted to see the manager at once, and that this person, this thief, must be thrown out of here immediately. But what happened next, or rather what did not happen, was what sent the first real chill down Marcus's spine. The server didn't move. He glanced at Elias, then back at Marcus, and remained standing there with a strange, uncertain expression. Marcus glared at him and repeated the order once more, louder and sharper. But still, not one of the uniformed staff members in the great hall stepped forward to carry out what he demanded. All of them stood oddly still, exchanging looks Marcus couldn't read. And for the first time in an evening he had believed he fully controlled, Marcus Sterling began to feel dimly and uneasily that something here lay entirely beyond his understanding. That quiet yet stubborn refusal to obey began to gnaw at the sense of control Marcus had always taken for granted as his own. Because in all his life, he had never once had to face the experience of issuing an order and watching it fall into empty space without anyone bothering to pick it up. He swept his eyes across the great hall. And this time, Instead of seeing bowed faces of submission or frightened evasive glances such as he was used to seeing whenever he grew angry, he encountered something entirely different. Something that confused him even more than open defiance would have. The servants scattered around the room didn't seem panicked. They simply stood there with a strange restraint. And in the way they glanced toward Elias and then back at one another, there was something like an unspoken understanding of which Marcus had no part. As if all of them knew some truth that he alone in this entire room was still too blind to recognize. Marcus shifted his gaze to the guests, hoping to find there the agreement he was certain he deserved. Hoping someone would nod in approval or offer a word of support for what he had just done. But what he received was only silence. And it was a silence more frightening than criticism. Because it was not empty, but heavy. Not the muteness of complicity, but the held breath of people waiting for something that was about to happen. The married couple who had been sitting near him were now staring intently down into the wine glasses in their hands, deliberately avoiding eye contact with him. The older man he had thought of as an ally was turning his body slightly away, as if trying to separate himself from the space that was gradually becoming dangerous around Marcus. And here and there in the crowd, whispers began passing from one ear to another, too soft for him to hear clearly, yet still enough for him to feel that people were speaking about something he should have known but did not know at all. A vague unease, a feeling Marcus had not tasted in so many years that he had almost forgotten it existed, began to creep into him. At first only a small ripple at the bottom of his heart, then slowly widening into a suspicion that became harder and harder to deny. The suspicion that perhaps he had misjudged something very important. He tried to steady himself, smoothing the lapel of his jacket, lifting his chin in the way he always did to reassert his authority. But the gesture now carried a stiffness, like an actor trying to cling to his role even as the stage beneath his feet began to crack. And then his eyes suddenly stopped on a man from the security team standing near the main exit. A beta who had just raised one finger to touch the small earpiece fitted at his ear, listening to something being transmitted to him. Marcus saw his face change. Not in panic, but in a way that chilled him even more. The look of a man who had just realized that an incident he had thought was minor was not minor at all. The man straightened, his shoulders tightening. And he looked toward the passage leading out from the study deep inside the estate, then began to move, not toward Elias as Marcus secretly hoped, but in another direction, as if clearing a path, as if preparing for the arrival of someone. Marcus followed his steps with a tightening feeling in his chest. And though he still couldn't understand what was happening, though he still tried to hold on to the belief that he was in command, he couldn't deny the cold instinct rising within him that the balance of this room, the balance he had believed was tilted entirely in his favor, was silently shifting toward another side he could not control. Julian Cross was not the kind of man who made a noisy entrance. His presence simply arrived. The way pressure arrives before a storm, quiet at first, then sudden, carrying with it the quality of something that could not be reversed. He stepped out from the passage leading to the study deep inside the estate, tall and unhurried, not rushing in the slightest. And within only a few heartbeats, the whole room had felt him. The whispers died away, heads turned slightly, and the crowd, like invisible iron filings, rearranged itself around the magnetic field he gave off. A few guests straightened by reflex, others dipped their heads in greeting, and even the most powerful people in the room, those accustomed to being respected by others, unconsciously adjusted their posture as he passed. Because in the world they all belonged to, everyone understood that this man stood on a different level. He said nothing as he entered. His cold, sharp eyes swept across the room with methodical precision, reading the temperature of the space in the way he always did, taking in the tense stillness at the center of the great hall, taking in the restrained worry on the faces of the staff. And then that gaze stopped on Elias. He was standing a few steps away from Marcus, his back still straight, his face still holding its familiar composure. But on his left cheek, beneath the crystal lights, there was an unmistakable red mark. A trace so clear it told its own story without needing a single word. Julian stopped walking. Everyone standing around him seemed to freeze with him. And the room fell into a silence even deeper than before. Not the silence of a crowd waiting for someone to speak, but the held breath of people who understood that something serious had just happened and were waiting to see where it would lead. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He only looked once around the room and asked a single question in the low, flat voice of a man asking something whose answer he already suspected, yet still asking because the question itself was part of judgment. He asked who had done this. No one answered at once. The silence stretched heavily. Several guests lowered their eyes to their hands. And then from the back, an older man with a calm bearing and sharp eyes stepped forward. It was Salvatore Rizzi, Julian's right hand for many years, the beta who had witnessed the entire incident from a hidden corner of the room. Without embellishment, without commentary, without accusation, he briefly and precisely recounted what had happened. That the guest had loudly accused the housekeeper of stealing a piece of jewelry, that the housekeeper had offered to open the safe to prove otherwise, but the offer had been refused, and that after a series of insults, the guest had struck him across the face in the middle of the great hall before everyone present. When that account ended, Julian looked at Elias, and Elias met his gaze, giving a nod so slight, it was almost imperceptible, confirming what had just been said without adding a single word. Marcus, who had been standing there all this time with the feeling that the ground beneath his feet was becoming unstable, hurried to grasp what he believed was an opportunity to turn the situation around. Because he had met Julian several times at past events, and had always assumed that some kind of equal relationship existed between them, he stepped forward, putting into his voice the reasonable tone of someone who believed he had done nothing wrong. And he began to explain, saying he was very sorry for this disturbance, but that Julian had to understand his circumstances. That after all, the person standing there was only a housekeeper, only an Omega, and a thieving Omega at that. So it was perfectly understandable if he had handled the matter a little forcefully. The moment those words left his mouth, the entire great hall seemed to sink another degree. And Julian didn't answer immediately. He simply let that sentence hang in the air. Let it settle and seep into every person listening. The way a rest note holds an entire piece of music, not as an absence, but as a presence with its own weight. When Marcus's words had fully settled, when the contemptuous echo of the words, only a housekeeper, and only an Omega, still seemed to linger in the air, Julian finally spoke slowly. And his voice was not loud, but every word he uttered was so clear and sharp that no one in the great hall could fail to hear it. He said that Marcus had just made a mistake he didn't even have enough understanding to recognize the size of. Then he turned fully toward the room and began telling all those powerful people standing there about the Omega in the gray uniform whom they had just watched be humiliated. He said that 7 years ago, this Omega, at a time when he himself was in desperate need, had by chance come into possession of something that belonged to Julian. Something that, had he chosen to keep it or sell it, could have brought him enough money to change his entire life. Or worse, could have been used to destroy Julian, to strike him with a fatal blow that very few of his enemies had ever been given the chance to deliver. He said Elias had not done that he had stood waiting in the cold to return to Julian what was his, intact and untouched. And when Julian asked him why, he had answered with only one simple sentence, because it wasn't his. The whole room fell silent and listened, and Julian went on. He said that throughout the 7 years since that day, this Omega had been the only person in his entire world whom he trusted absolutely. The only person to whom he gave the keys to his most private rooms. The only person who knew things that, if they ever reached the outside, could bring an entire enterprise crashing down. And that in all that time, with all those opportunities, he had never once, not even once, betrayed that trust. Then he looked straight at Marcus, and in a cold voice that had hardened into steel, He said that the Omega Marcus had just called a thieving housekeeper, had had more chances to betray Julian than anyone standing in this room, and he had never done so. While Marcus had betrayed a lifetime's worth of trust in the space of a single slap, simply because he could not endure the sight of a person he considered beneath him daring to stand upright before him. Those words fell over the room like a sentence. And to end any remaining doubt, to make the truth he had just revealed impossible to deny, Julian gave a small signal, and Elias, still with the same unchanged composure, quietly led a small group consisting of Julian, Salvatore, Marcus himself, and several witnesses toward the little room hidden behind the study. Before everyone's eyes, he placed the familiar key from its usual hiding place into the lock, opened the door to the room no one but he could enter, then stepped to the wall safe, entered the familiar code. And when the steel door opened, there it was, lying calmly in the exact separate compartment where he had placed it, recorded clearly under the correct number in the leather-covered ledger opened beside it. Marcus's family heirloom diamond tie pin glittered intact, without a single stone missing. The truth appeared before everyone's eyes, bare and undeniable. The tie pin had never been stolen. It had been in the safest place it could possibly be all along, watched over by the very person who had just been accused of stealing it. And the entire accusation Marcus had built, the entire public degradation he had poured over Elias's head, now stood revealed as a shameless lie, born not from truth, but from Marcus's own arrogance and malice. Marcus stood frozen, staring at his tie pin lying safely inside the safe. And for the first time that evening, his face could no longer hold its triumphant confidence, because he understood that now, before all the people whose respect he had once longed to command, he no longer had even 1 inch of ground left to stand on. When the group returned to the great hall with the truth fully exposed, as whispers began spreading like ripples from one person to another, an older man at a nearby table slowly rose to his feet. It was Arthur Whitfield, a man past 70, his silver hair neatly combed, his face carrying the composed look of someone who had lived through enough years not to be easily stirred by scandal. But now, on that face, there appeared an unusual emotion, a shock mingled with something that looked very much like late regret. He had sat quietly watching the entire incident from beginning to end, had heard every accusation, every insult Marcus had poured over Elias's head, and the more he listened, the more clearly a distant memory he had thought long asleep began to rise inside him. Because the scene unfolding before him tonight, the way a powerful alpha had built a theft accusation and then refused to listen to any explanation, the way he had moved from a missing object to attacking the victim's biology and background, all of it was chillingly familiar. As if he were watching again a play he had once witnessed many years before. Arthur spoke, and though his voice was not loud, it was steady enough to make the whole room turn and listen. He said that many years ago, he had been present in a house where he had seen this very alpha, this very Marcus Sterling, do exactly what he had done tonight. That at the time, a diamond ring had supposedly disappeared. And instead of investigating the matter properly, Marcus had immediately aimed the accusation at a young Omega housekeeper, the poorest and newest person in the house, someone who had no one behind him to protect himself. He said the young man had stood in the room and insisted he was innocent, had asked to be searched in order to prove his honesty. But exactly as tonight, Marcus hadn't bothered to listen to a single word, had thrown the young man out of the house that very night and withheld every bit of the wages he rightfully deserved, pushing an honest human being into hardship because of an accusation that had never been proven. And then, as he told that story, Arthur's eyes slowly shifted toward Elias, looking carefully at the calm face and gray eyes before him. And the truth his mind had just pieced together seemed to catch in his throat. Because he realized that the young Omega who had been falsely accused all those years ago, the victim of that unjust performance he had witnessed and had regretted for years because he hadn't dared speak up, was no one else but the man standing there now. It was Elias. That revelation shook the entire great hall. and every gaze immediately turned toward Marcus, who now stood rooted in place with a bloodless face. Because the most terrible thing was not merely that his old wrongdoing had been exposed, but that he realized he had just repeated that same wrongdoing upon the very same person. A person he had not even recognized all evening long. Marcus had stood facing Elias, had looked into his face, had insulted him with the cruelest words, and not once had there flashed in his memory the image of the young man he had once pushed into the street. Because to Marcus, Omegas had never been individuals with distinct faces and separate fates worth remembering. They were only a type, a blurred and replaceable background. And it was precisely that contempt sunk so deep he had never bothered to truly see a human being that had blinded him and sent him rushing straight into the trap his own past had set. The circle of consequence had closed perfectly and cruelly in the middle of that gilded hall. And Elias, the only person who knew the truth of that old story better than anyone else in the room, simply looked at the alpha who had once destroyed a part of his life. Not with the satisfied gaze of someone watching an enemy fall, but with the deep stillness of a person who had traveled so far beyond that wound that now he saw before him only a man collapsing under the weight of the very things he himself had sown. Julian Cross was not the kind of man who needed loud threats or crude acts to make a person face consequences, because the power he held operated in a far quieter way, far more discreetly, and for that very reason, it was many times more ruthless. He turned to speak with several guests standing nearby in his usual low and composed voice. And in those few brief sentences, he mentioned a truth that everyone present in that room silently understood but rarely said aloud. That Marcus Sterling's husband, a politician with many ambitions, had long depended on a series of important projects and permits that, without the backing of the network of relationships Julian controlled, would never have been able to take shape. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to issue any threat. He simply stated calmly that from this moment on, every form of support, every door he had once been willing to open for the Sterling family, would be closed. That the agreements currently under discussion would be suspended indefinitely, and that he was not in the habit of continuing business with people willing to trample another person's dignity merely to satisfy their own ego. That statement was spoken so calmly, it was almost gentle, carrying no visible emotion. Simply the announcement of a decision made by a man accustomed to making decisions that changed the fate of others. And the effect it created in the room unfolded with a speed and finality that made people feel cold. The very people who only a few hours earlier had surrounded Marcus with warm smiles, the partners who had once eagerly discussed cooperation with his family, now began making small, but deeply meaningful adjustments. A slight lean away. A gaze suddenly busy with the screen of a phone. A polite enough excuse to step away and speak with someone across the room. Two men who had come to the gala that evening intending to discuss a joint project with Marcus quietly moved toward Julian, joining another conversation. And by that gesture, they silently declared which side they had chosen. News of what had just happened spread through the great hall with the unstoppable momentum only upper-class scandal can possess. And as it spread, scattered pieces about Marcus Sterling, stories of how he had treated those beneath him, the times he had humiliated servants, the anecdotes people had once whispered behind his back, suddenly found a context in which to speak together. And the image he had spent so many years carefully building began to crack apart in pieces before his eyes. Marcus stood there in the middle of the room that had once been the stage for his pride, and silently watched the world he had believed he had conquered turn its back on him one person at a time. One look at a time. One departing step at a time. And in that moment, he understood a truth he had never had to face in all his life, that the social empire he had built had not been founded on real respect at all, but had only been temporarily raised on fear and advantage. And that once the most powerful man in the room withdrew his endorsement, all that remained of him was an empty shell. He had entered this room tonight with the iron belief that it was simply another stage on which he would shine, another arena where victory was already his. But now he understood that he had miscalculated disastrously, that he had utterly failed to recognize where he was standing and whom he was facing. And that late understanding came down upon him with a weight he had never felt in an entire life sheltered by money and power. When the evening had moved toward its end, and the commotion had slowly settled into a heavy stillness, Marcus Sterling, with a walk that was entirely different from the way he had entered, no longer carrying his usual proud, imposing stride, but instead moving with a strained caution as though the ground beneath his feet had become unsteady, slowly approached Elias, who was standing near the entrance to the service area, quietly overseeing the last remaining duties. He stopped in front of him, and in a voice far smaller than the shrill, commanding one he had used only hours before, he said that he owed Elias an apology, that what he had done was wrong, and that he hoped Elias could forgive him. Elias looked at him for a long while, neither cruel nor angry, only calm and clear in his honesty. And then he answered that he had heard the words Marcus had said, but that he had lived long enough and passed through enough rooms to understand the difference between a person who regrets what they have done and a person who only regrets the price they must pay for it, and that he could not yet be certain which side of that line Marcus was standing on. He said that what had happened tonight, not only the slap, but everything before it, every word of contempt, every act of looking down on another human being because of the clothes they wore or the work they did, because of the biology they were born with, was not the kind of wound that could be mended by a hurried apology offered while everything was collapsing, and that he would give himself the time he needed to decide how to answer that apology. Not here. Not tonight. Not under the pressure of a room full of people. He said all of it gently, without a trace of hatred, looking straight into Marcus's eyes. And it was precisely that calm lack of resentment that made his words heavier than any scolding could have been. Marcus stood silent for a moment, then gave a small nod, turned, and walked toward the exit, passing through the same people who only hours earlier had been willing to talk with him, but now answered him only with the cold politeness of strangers. No one stopped him. No one reached out a hand. And then he disappeared behind the door, stepping into the night where the city went on turning without needing him anymore. After he had gone, Julian stepped into the center of the great hall and did something that stunned everyone who truly knew him. He spoke up and asked that his housekeeper be invited before everyone. And when Elias stepped out from the service corridor, the whole room looked at him. Then one by one, and then all at once, the most powerful people in the city quietly rose to their feet, and applause rang out, beginning in one corner and spreading like a wave until it embraced the entire great hall. A sincere and rare tribute that in that world was the most precious kind of wealth anyone could offer. Elias received it all with a slight bow and a modest smile, making no attempt to step into the center of attention nor to linger beneath the glow any longer than courtesy allowed. And then, with the same quiet manner in which he had appeared, he turned and went back toward the small room behind the hall, back to the work he had always valued more than any applause. But before he could disappear through the service corridor, a hand caught his elbow, gentle but firm. He turned, and found Julian standing there, closer than he usually allowed himself to be. The Alpha's dark eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made Elias's breath catch slightly. "Elias," Julian said, his voice low enough that only the two of them could hear. "You should have called for me the moment it started. You should have." "I could handle it," Elias replied quietly. "I've handled worse." Julian's jaw tightened. His hand moved from Elias's elbow to the side of his face, so carefully, so gently, as if he were touching something infinitely precious. His thumb brushed across the red mark still visible on Elias's cheek, and something dark and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I don't care how much you can handle," Julian said, his voice rougher now. "I care that someone dared to raise a hand to you. In my house. In front of everyone. As if you were just a housekeeper," Elias offered, a faint, wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Just an Omega?" Julian's eyes blazed. "You are not just anything. You never have been. Not to me." The words hung between them, heavy with something neither of them had ever spoken aloud. Elias felt his heart stutter in his chest, a ridiculous, childish reaction he had long thought he'd trained out of himself. "Julian," he began, but the alpha shook his head. "Not here. Not now. But I need you to know." Julian stopped, his composure cracking for just a moment. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "I need you to know that what you did tonight, the way you stood there, the way you didn't break. I have never seen anyone with that kind of strength. Not in any alpha I've ever known. Not anywhere." Elias looked down at the floor, suddenly unable to meet those intense dark eyes. "I just did what I always do. What my mother taught me." "Your mother raised someone extraordinary," Julian said softly. "And I have been trying for 7 years to find the right words to tell you that." Elias's head snapped up. His gray eyes searched Julian's face, looking for something, confirmation, perhaps, of what he had long suspected but never dared to believe. "Julian, come to my study tonight," Julian said. "After everyone has left. When the house is quiet. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Elias felt his throat tighten. "What is it?" But Julian only shook his head, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Tonight. I promise. Just be there. Please." And then, before Elias could respond, Julian turned and walked back into the glittering crowd, the mask of the cold, untouchable alpha sliding back into place. Elias stood there for a long moment, his hand lifting unconsciously to the place on his cheek, where Julian's thumb had brushed. The skin still tingled, not from the slap, but from the warmth of that touch. In the silent room behind the great hall, when the sounds from the gala had faded into only a faint echo through the walls, Elias paused for a moment. And in his mind appeared the image of his mother from long ago, hands roughened by water and soap, but a back that had never bent. And the words she had given him with her final breath, that he must never let anyone make him believe he was beneath them. Because he wasn't. Elias understood that through all the years, through every false accusation, every contemptuous glance, every door slammed in his face, he had lived exactly as his mother had told him to live. He had not allowed the low ceiling other people tried to press down over him to become the true limit of his life. And the dignity his mother had left him, the only treasure not kept inside any safe, had always been there, intact, through everything. Because a human being's dignity has never been something granted by another person's recognition, nor something that can be taken away by anyone's contempt. It is not a title, a position, or a number in a bank account. It exists before a room fills with people, and remains after the room has emptied. And it belongs forever to the one who has chosen to live inside it fully. Elias's story reminds each of us of something simple yet profound, that a person's true worth is never found in the work they do, the clothing they wear, the biology they were born with, or the fortune they possess, but in the kindness, honesty, and dignity they patiently guard through the most ordinary days. And that the way we treat people who can bring us no benefit is the truest measure of who we are. Later that night, when the last guest had departed and the estate had fallen into silence, Elias made his way to the study. His heart pounded with an irregular rhythm he couldn't control, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was young and foolish enough to believe in fairy tales. The study door was ajar, and through the crack, he could see Julian standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit sea. He had removed his jacket and loosened his tie, and in the soft light, he looked younger somehow, less armored. Elias knocked softly. Julian turned, and the expression on his face when he saw Elias made the Omega's breath catch in his throat. It was raw, vulnerable, something Julian Cross never allowed anyone to see. "You came," Julian said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of wonder. "I said I would," Elias replied, stepping into the room. "I always keep my word. You know that." Julian crossed the room in 3 quick strides, stopping just inches away, close enough that Elias could smell him, cedar and smoke and something darker, richer, something that made his Omega instinct stir in ways he had spent years carefully suppressing. "Elias," Julian's voice was barely a whisper. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. Elias nodded, his throat too tight for words. Julian reached out and took both of Elias's hands in his. His grip was warm and steady. 7 years ago, when you returned that briefcase, I thought it was luck. A coincidence. A rare moment of honesty from someone desperate enough to think it would pay off somehow. I was wrong. I was so wrong about you. He paused, his thumb stroking over Elias's calloused knuckles. 7 years I've watched you. 7 years I've trusted you with everything I have, everything I am. And in all that time, I never once told you what you truly are to me. Not just my housekeeper. Not just the person I trust most. But, Julian's voice cracked. He stopped, took a breath, and continued. I have lived my entire life trusting no one. I have been betrayed by people I thought loved me, used by people I thought respected me, and I built walls so high around myself that I forgot what it felt like to want someone inside them. And then you came. Quiet, steady, honest. You never asked for anything. You never tried to take advantage. You were there. Every single day. And somewhere along the way, I stopped wanting to keep you out. Elias felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back furiously. Julian, he started, but the alpha shook his head. Let me finish. Please. He lifted one hand to Elias's cheek again, the same gesture from before, but this time it lingered. I am an alpha, a powerful one. I have the world at my feet, but none of it matters when I walk into a room and look for you first. None of it matters when I go to sleep at night, and my last thought is whether you are well, whether you are safe, whether you know. He stopped again, and this time, when he spoke, his voice was almost broken. Whether you know that I love you. Elias's breath left him in a rush. He stood there, frozen, staring at the man who had just. Say something, Julian whispered. His eyes were dark and searching, desperate in a way that made Elias's heart ache. Please, even if you don't feel the same, just say something. Elias opened his mouth, closed it, and then, before he could think, before he could second-guess himself, he did something he had never done in 7 years of perfect professionalism. He closed the distance between them and kissed Julian. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't hesitant. It was all the years of silence and stolen glances and words unspoken pouring out at once. And Julian responded immediately, his hands coming up to frame Elias's face, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierceness that made Elias's knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against Elias's. His laugh was shaky, almost disbelieving. 7 years, Julian murmured. 7 years I waited to do that. Elias laughed too, a soft, breathless sound. You could have done it sooner. I didn't think. Julian shook his head. I didn't think you would want. Julian. Elias pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. I have been in love with you since the moment you knocked before entering a room where I was working. Because you were the first person in my entire life who treated me like I mattered. Like I was worth the decency of a door. Julian's eyes widened. Then he pulled Elias into his arms, holding him so tightly that Elias could barely breathe. I'm never letting you go, Julian said into his hair. I don't care what anyone thinks. I don't care about any of it. You're mine. You've been mine for 7 years. I was too much of a coward to admit it. Elias laughed again, his face pressed against Julian's chest. You? A coward? The man who terrifies half the city. Everyone except you, Julian said. I could never scare you, even from the beginning. Do you know how much that meant to me? That you looked at me and saw someone worth trusting? That you never flinched? Elias pulled back and looked up at him. You never scared me because you never gave me a reason to be scared. You respected me. You gave me a chance to prove myself, and then you trusted me with everything. That's not something a person forgets. Julian touched his cheek again, the one with the fading red mark. His eyes darkened. I should have been there sooner. I should have protected you from him. You did, Elias said softly. You came. You told the truth. You stood up for me in front of everyone. That's all I needed. It's not all I wanted to do, Julian said, his voice hardening slightly. I wanted to. I know. Elias reached up and took Julian's hand, pressing a kiss to his palm. I know. But you did the right thing. You let the truth speak for itself. That's more than he ever deserved. Julian let out a long breath. Then he smiled. A real smile. Warm and unguarded, so different from his usual cold mask that it made Elias's heart stutter. I love you, Julian said again, as if the words had been trapped inside him for too long and now couldn't stop coming out. I love you, Elias. I don't know how we make this work. I don't know what it looks like. But I want to figure it out. Together. If you'll let me. Elias leaned up and kissed him again, slower this time, sweeter, a promise wrapped in the touch of lips and the warmth of breath. Together, he said against Julian's mouth. I like the sound of that.